Again, many thanks to both Becky Moore, who's chair of the Advisory Council, and Megan Doherty, our very new executive director of the Museum of the White Mountains. And we're so excited you're here, Megan. Thank you. Well, welcome to Mountain Voices, a monthly celebration of the White Mountains and of the Lakes region. So this year, Mountain Voices has been highlighting the research of the Plymouth State faculty and what they're doing in the White Mountains and the Lakes regions. If you're interested in seeing past presentations, I'm going to put the information on where you can find them in the chat box once we're about halfway through the program. During this presentation, if you have any questions or comment that you would like to make, we're going to keep everybody muted, but you can put it down in the chat box. If you don't know where the chat box is, for those of you who haven't done this, I know most of us have, but you know, there's always somebody new. If you move your mouse at the bottom, you will see that one little button that says chat. Click on that and you will be able to add your comment or question. And then at the end, Megan is going to give questions to Amy and she'll read whatever you have written. Tonight, we are lucky enough to be able to learn about the direct and indirect effects of fragmentation in New Hampshire and how to avoid the future loss of nature from Professor Amy Villamagna. Professor Villamagna is an associate professor of environmental science and policy at the Center for the Environment at Plymouth State. She teaches undergraduate and graduate environmental science and policy programs. She also teaches in the geography and the sustainability minor. Dr. Villamagna uses a combination of field and GIS methods to explore how changes in land use and climate affect ecosystems. By incorporating the principles of landscape, ecosystem, and community ecology, she identifies key patterns and processes in natural and semi-natural environments. I'm really looking forward to learning more from you, Amy. Thank you. Please go right ahead.
Thanks very much. Everybody be patient with me as I jockey through two screens, and then I will not be distracted here. So make sure I pull up the right one, and then.
Looks good.
Marcia, do you want to make me a co-host and I can help with the letting folks come in?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So just to be sure, can you guys see the title slide and the title slide alone?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Okay, now I just need to move you out of the way so I'm not distracted by you right now. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I also just want to thank on behalf of all of the PSU faculty that'll be presenting. It's really fantastic opportunity to be able to present our research that is often extremely local and, you know, regionally sort of anchored to the audience. Oftentimes we're only presenting at professional conferences that might be, you know, in Timbuktu, basically, and those people don't necessarily understand the importance of the sense of place that comes with our research. And so I very much appreciate this opportunity. In fact, when I was asked, I sort of jumped on the opportunity, but initially I thought I would be focusing on maybe just sharing one piece of my research. And instead I did what probably most academics do. And I went a little beyond that. And I really tried to take this opportunity to connect the dots among my research endeavors so far. And it's really rare to have that opportunity. So I had to pull myself out of the weeds and really think more broadly about how I've been spending my days. I moved to Plymouth in 2014, and over the past 8 years, I've been sort of chipping away at different projects as they relate to our natural environment and our semi-natural environment, with a specific focus here in New Hampshire. And it's interesting because when I first moved here, I thought to myself, man, this place has like no environmental problems at all. It's so pristine. It's like all wilderness. And I should give you the rationale for that is because I moved up from Virginia, had lived in Maryland, and grew up in Southern New York. So moving to New Hampshire was like, oh my gosh, everything's so beautiful. There's no problems. And so I chipped away a little bit here and there on different research, some of which you'll hear today. And where I've really come actually through this sort of organizing this presentation, which made me think, I was like, oh, maybe I could pursue a book on this topic or something like that. So again, thank you for the opportunity. It made me realize that New Hampshire is really no different than all these other places that I lived, except we're in a time machine and we're pretty much behind the times of what the rest of the US and what the rest of the globe looks like. So like most places, New Hampshire is not a stranger to the effects of development and land use change. So historically, these patterns were driven by intensive logging, and today by rapidly expanding residential development. Our nature is fragmented, and the effects of such are impacting biodiversity and how nature itself functions. So whether you consider the logging roads that crisscross the northern forest, or the highways and the byways of the lakes and the coastal plain regions, nature fragmentation is threatening the persistence of iconic species alongside of their lesser known counterparts. So in this presentation, we're going to explore the direct and indirect effects of nature fragmentation in New Hampshire, and also how to avoid the future loss of nature. So we'll start off thinking about the fundamentals of fragmentation through the lens of sort of this basic understanding of what it means and the mechanisms that drive it. I'm going to describe a little bit of my recent research since moving to New Hampshire. And then alongside each of those is going to be a description of what our current fights against fragmentation are. So when we think of nature, we can really think of it in a variety of ways, but it's essentially made up of variety. And this variety is expressed in gradients, which are perceived through texture. So even if you look at this photo of the whites, you'll see the texture, right? You see the elevational gradient. We see snow on top of the mountains. We can even see some of our drainages in these areas over here and how they're different. And so what's creating that are natural processes are yielding these patterns. And most of these natural patterns reflect a relatively gradual shift from one state to the next. Even in areas where there's somewhat of a dramatic shift, there are gradients or gradual changes. So even if you're thinking about a riparian area where you might have a stream cutting through a forest, right? There's a bit of an abrupt change between a terrestrial and an aquatic environment, but we do see great gradients along the edges that are characterized by differences in biological organisms. And that's really what gives nature that texture, right? Like that deep, rich feeling that when you look at it, you feel like you could stare at it for an hour. And in every minute of that hour, you would notice something different. And that's really that beauty, that depth that nature has. In contrast to nature, human-made changes across the landscape are usually abrupt, and they're very dramatic. And they're these dramatic shifts in both physical and ecological structure and function. And these are just some examples of those that we see across our landscape here in New Hampshire, but also most definitely throughout the rest of the US and most certainly the world. So I recently drove down to the Mid-Atlantic region to visit family, and along the way, I noticed, as I almost always do, this dramatic shift in the landscape. So driving south makes this piece of nature here in New Hampshire, especially living so close to the whites and in the lakes region, feel like wilderness to me. And the farther I drive away from it, the more concerned, the more like uneasy, stressed, anxious, and even paranoid I feel, because as I start to go further south and see more development, I fear that we're going to have the same fate. We're going to have the same loss of non-human nature creeping into our backyards. And we already see evidence of this in southern and the southeastern portions of our state, where the majority of the population lives. And then anyone who tried to recreate in central or northern New Hampshire since March 2020 has certainly felt it there as well. So you can be in the deep parts of the whites these days, and you still feel a little crowded sometimes. So this aerial image that you're looking at depicts a little bit of nature fragmentation at two different scales. So one on the left, thinking about the White Mountains and what's really carving in to this natural mosaic, this natural fabric of the White Mountains is going to be roadways, very little development. Whereas if you look in Manchester, right, we really see that nature is being carved away by roads, but then also by development and the residual effects around those. So I love this quote, no matter what ecosystem, forest, prairie, patch, or moss, the effects of habitat fragmentation or nature fragmentation are ruinous, right? So in the end, no matter where you're looking, if it's in northern New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire, Lakes region, habitat fragmentation is going to be problematic. So while many of us may not look out across these landscapes and think, wow, there's some serious fragmentation here, we can still sense it. And I challenge you, the next time you're driving around and you get out of the whites and you go farther away into more developed, and especially when you're in Florida. I went to college in Florida, so especially when you're in Florida, sort of feel it, feel the difference, right? It's not a sixth sense that we have. Nature, when it's fragmented, feels different. It smells, tastes, looks different. And so from here on out, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the effects of nature fragmentation, and even more specifically on biodiversity. So in this context, fragmentation is referred to as, or known as, this gradual breaking apart of natural landscapes into smaller patches. And the effects of that are both the reduction of nature in and of itself, but even just the fragmented aspect of it, the breaking apart and these smaller pieces. So there was a 2015 peer-reviewed article that was sort of a meta-analysis looking at many studies that had summarized the results of nature fragmentation over long-term periods. And what they found was that fragmented habitats lose on average about half of their plant and animal species within 20 years, and that some will continue to lose species for 30 years or more. And that's after the fragmentation occurs, right? So even though we don't see it initially, the effects of it are long lasting and irreversible at many points. And in all of the cases they examined, the worst losses occurred in the smallest habitat patches. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means. To me, what the scariest result of that analysis that they did was finding in 2015, mind you, so now 7 years later, at that point, 70% of the world's forest was within only 1 kilometer of an edge. So what that's really taking away is that core feeling we have in the forest, like when you're deep in the whites, that feeling of solitude, the feeling of natural processes at work, everything about that balance. And in most of our forests, that's already gone. And that realization should make all of us feel extremely fortunate to live where we are and to have this amazing resource. And I don't mean resource to use as in, chop down and turn it into furniture. I mean to embrace and to enjoy while we're here and to know all the beautiful services that it provides. So to better explain how or why this happens, this change, why fragmentation is problematic, we can consider this fairly simplified diagram of fragmentation that uses a forested landscape as an example. So landscapes are comprised of a variety of habitats. And in this case, when I say habitat, I'm referring to a place where a species lives, a place that has everything that specific species needs. So it's able to meet all of its needs in that area. And some species can thrive in a wide range of habitats, and they're tolerant to tons of disturbance. And that's because they possess certain functional traits, certain things that they do, whether it's behaviors, whether it's physical traits that they have, that enables them to be successful in these different areas. They have strategies for that. Or maybe they have a really high tolerance to disturbance, things along those lines. And those species include things that we commonly see throughout town, like raccoons, possums, white-footed mice, from the bird world, blue jays, robins, American crows. So these species are oftentimes referred to as generalist species. They're species that are very flexible. Other species tend to have a much narrower range of habitat requirements, meaning that they might have a lower tolerance for disturbance, or they might need much larger areas to fulfill all of their needs for foraging, which is eating, finding food, resting, and reproducing. And these include wide-ranging species such as bear, moose, wolves, which we no longer have on our landscape, cold-adapted species like brook trout, and those with poor dispersal abilities such as salamanders, right? Some of our amphibians, which are really being plagued by this. And then forest interior species or high elevation songbirds, you can think of that. So a single patch of contiguous landscape, when that's broken up and the pieces that remain, they're smaller, as you can see here, but also at the same time, the area of what we refer to as an edge habitat, which exists along those edges, increases. And those that can do well in those areas, those species, will tend to become more prolific. And as a result, we'll see a shift in the diversity that exists in these areas. Since the edges of habitats are generally very, very different in both composition and function than the interior, then we can really expect a major change in terms of what that habitat will feel like, or what that piece of nature will feel like. And this illustration is just depicting how the edge, the proportional influence of edge, as we continue to fragment into smaller pieces, how that proportion of edge starts to really consume or over influence or tip the scale on what that nature is starting to look like, right? However, it isn't just the size of the fragment, it's also the shape that can influence the composition in terms of biotic organisms or the function that's occurring. And it's that shape that we can really see shifting things. So in this example here on the left-hand side, it gives you an example of a 1 hectare plot of land. And with something that small, you really don't have anything that could be considered interior habitat. At a 10 hectare level, you have about 53% of that being edge habitat. And the larger you get, the percent of that edge decreases. But when we take into account the shape, right, even the same area or a moderately sized area could have 0 interior type of habitat because it's long and narrow, right? So there's always an influence of the edge around it. So when we revisit the initial comparison I made between the White Mountains and Manchester, we can see that the fragments in Manchester, for example, are becoming smaller and smaller with every new road that's being put in, every time land's being converted, and that it's the shape of these fragments as well that's problematic. They're certainly not ecologically minded. They're haphazard at best, and oftentimes they are economically driven, right? So we don't necessarily see nature's voice coming through to defend the area in these cases. So I would be remiss not to show at least one slide with lots of critters on it. So these are just a few of the very many species that are affected by nature fragmentation for one reason or another. Some of them, it's that poor dispersal ability. Others are, they're constrained to aquatic ecosystems. Others that they maneuver, but they're real slow and it's hard to get out of the way. Maybe they require a lot of land or they move seasonally. So we're going to keep talking about some of these, but in a different way. So when I was trying to pull together this talk, and again, I really am going to try to connect the dots for a lot of research that I've done, I had to try to think very holistically about nature fragmentation. And it really was only in reflecting and preparing for this presentation that I realized, oh my gosh, all my research does make sense. It is all related to something that I could actually put under an umbrella. So again, thank you. But when we start thinking holistically about nature fragmentation, there's so many different angles and avenues to pursue or to consider. So this diagram is a very simplified, perhaps oversimplified way of thinking about nature fragmentation, the indirect and the direct effects here. So if we just think about it in terms of what the threat is, nature fragmentation, we see that it can have direct effects on water and soil quality, the hydrology or the movement of water, the patterns with our water, primary productivity, and that those three, among others, will affect habitat quality. And one thing I want to mention is just that habitat quality is going to be different for every species. So whenever someone refers to habitat quality, we're essentially saying, the quality of a habitat for any species, and recognizing that that might be different for different species. But ultimately, habitat fragmentation, nature fragmentation will affect it in one way or another. And then the bottom tier of this is thinking about how all of these things directly and indirectly will affect biodiversity, shifting biodiversity composition. So if we think about what is biodiversity, oftentimes people think of it as how many species might be in an area. But in actuality, going back to what we talked about or what I mentioned about the texture of our landscape, of our nature, that texture changes based on what species are there. It's like a different flavor of nature based on the composition. And much of that is driven by native species. So when we start to see shifts in biodiversity, we might also incur loss of native species and incur a little bit more of non-natives that again shift what we're seeing. And then as well, the nature fragmentation has direct impacts on human well-being and resilience, as well as indirect relationships there too. So what I'm going to do is walk you through this diagram a little bit more specifically at each level, and that will kind of give you a clue about the research that I'll be talking about. So nature fragmentation has the ability to increase pollution that we see both terrestrial and in our aquatic systems. It disturbs soil, most certainly if you think about roads coming through or land development, building a house, clearing a forest, and through those processes increase erosion. All of those things can decrease soil and water quality. We also see increased surface runoff because we've taken away sort of the natural permeability or the natural sponginess of nature by paving over it, or even, you know, if you have a gravel drive, it changes things. As soon as you put a roof on anything, it changes things. And what that'll do is it'll increase the flashiness of water. And we see it all, pretty much all the time now. Anytime you go into town, we have a strong storm and water's running off our pavement pretty quickly. And all of that's going into our waterways. That's changing the rhythm of the way the water moves. And then also by having nature fragmentation, there's a loss. There's an inherent loss anytime you have fragmentation. And so that's a reduced area for primary producers, plants and trees, to capture solar energy, convert it into energy that is then retained within an ecosystem and then will trickle through food webs all the way up to us, really. So anytime you have fragmentation, all of these things can be altered. And it's through those alterations that we see changes in habitat quality. Sometimes that change in habitat quality can come from a direct barrier to species movement. That's something we're going to talk about today. The idea that where they belong, where they should be, has become so small that they need to move, they need to get out. And in their movement, right, they actually incur poor habitat quality as part of that. And with that decrease in habitat quality, we have a decrease in habitat suitability for our native species. But sometimes that leaves the window open for non-native species that have what we refer to as like a competitive advantage. They can come in, they're more tolerant of disturbance, they have adapted traits that do really well in these areas, and they'll succeed and outcompete the natives. And so at the next level, we start to see these shifts in biodiversity. We might see direct mortality through human-wildlife conflict. So for example, wildlife collisions with vehicles, and that's something I'll be talking about today too. We also see a decrease in the genetic diversity of the populations of our native species based on barriers to movement, and I'll talk more about that today. Ultimately, these things end up decreasing the health of an individual, but also decreasing the resilience of a population. And those populations come together to make our natural communities, the things that are the fabric and the patterns of our nature. And then with the shift in biodiversity composition and the loss of native diversity, we see that that impacts human well-being. That's been positively shown that there is a direct link between biodiversity and ecosystem services to human well-being. So as we degrade our natural world, we are degrading our ability to maintain and be resilient humans as part of the process. And of course, any conceptual model I will ever make will always have a feedback loop in it. So if we decrease our human well-being, we will ultimately find ways to mess things up more in trying to fix them with more fragmentation. So given this model of direct and indirect effects of fragmentation, I'm going to now shift gears and describe how I've focused my research efforts since moving to New Hampshire in 2014. So here are a few examples of research that I've been working on. As Marcia mentioned at the beginning, much of my research and scholarship uses different techniques. So in the summers, I'm largely in the field collecting data. So I'm out in nature. In the off season, as I like to refer to it, I might be on a computer working with geographic information systems, so mapping and analyzing spatial patterns as we go through. So these projects reflect oftentimes both of those things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, except this one in the bottom right that I just couldn't squeeze in no matter what. But all of these come with a lot of partners. I've been very fortunate to collaborate with tons of people here in New Hampshire and a lot of agencies and organizations, including New Hampshire Fish and Game, the U.S. Forest Service, Meredith Conservation Commission, the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, Conservation Fund, the Pemigewasset chapter of Trout Unlimited, and I forgot to mention it here, the Basil Woods chapter of Trout Unlimited, the New Hampshire Water Resources Center, USGS, and then several wonderful colleagues here at PSU and plenty of research assistants that have come through, more than I could list here. So I kind of gave up actually. But one thing that you'll notice as I go through with my research is that they share one thing in common, and that's roads. I like to refer to roads as the great fragmentor in sort of a Harry Potterish kind of way. The effects of roads are complete fragmenters of nature. After working on this issue for somewhat haphazardly for the past 8 years, I can't help but agree with Professor Lawrence, who wrote that roads scare the hell out of ecologists, and that's absolutely true, because you really cannot deny how transformative they are. They are roadways, pathways into a different future. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to provide examples of my research and then also give examples of how we are trying to fight these fates of fragmentation that I mentioned earlier. So let's start by exploring some earlier research that I did, which examined the two main effects of roads through the establishment and spread of a non-native species. And I'm sure you guys recognize this one. It's pretty much everywhere now. So Japanese knotweed is the non-native species. It's pervasive throughout the eastern United States and has an incredible growth and spreading capacity. It leads to the devaluing of property values like you see here, but it also influences the species diversity of the places it invades, which includes, for those of you that are near Plymouth, the Baker River Valley. This picture is coming out of Rumney, and it's just one of the many areas that have been really influenced by Japanese knotweed that you can see along this corridor in here. So the project that I worked on had focused on trying to understand where Japanese knotweed was occurring in the Meredith area. I give tons of credit to the Conservation Commission. They were already underway trying to lead a public outreach and education campaign. And what they needed was data. They needed to know, where is it? How big of a problem is it? How can we think about it? And so me and a grad student and an undergraduate student back in 2015 took the summer to map out Japanese knotweed, evaluate it based on a whole bunch of different metrics, how dense it was, how widespread it was. And you can sort of see that in some of these maps in here. And really what we found from this project was that knotweed, as expected, spreads along disturbed habitats. It's very quick to colonize and to dominate the system, which is why it's so prevalent throughout New Hampshire. It outcompetes native species for space, so there was definitely a shift in biodiversity in these areas. And we found later that the areas where knotweed was most prevalent was in the areas where there was fill dirt included, so that we're thinking that the seeds or even the rhizomes were introduced through the fill dirt. And all of that is just a great example of how through fragmentation with our roadways, we're actually creating opportunities and oftentimes directly spreading non-native species in that way. So this was sort of like the very first thing I had focused on when I was here in New Hampshire. And I didn't really connect the dots until I started to work on this presentation. So the next example examines the degradation of habitat quality as a result of surface water runoff from, again, the great fragmenter roadways. And in this case, we're going to look at the decreased habitat suitability as it relates to decreased habitat quality. In this USGS survey funded project, which was back in 2016 to 2017, which we belovedly called hot salty bugs, we investigated the influence of road salts on water chemistry, but also on aquatic biodiversity. We focused mainly on macroinvertebrates because it was something that was fairly easy to sample. I had two graduate students and 2 undergraduate students work with me on this. And our sampling locations were generally within central New Hampshire. We had a few southern New Hampshire sites, and we measured during both 2016 and 2017, And what we ended up looking through is using macroinvertebrates to understand overall water quality. So when you dip a bottle into the water and take a water sample, it's a really excellent snapshot example of what water quality is. It tells you exactly what it is at that time. However, with a lot of our pollutants, and when you think about the impacts of pollutants on our biological organisms, you're not necessarily capturing the moment when it's problematic. Oftentimes you're not out sampling during a major storm event. So if you're interested in the overall effects or sort of the chronic effects, then macroinvertebrates, which are considered really strong indicators of water quality, are excellent, is an excellent avenue to pursue. So the evidence from this 2-year study suggested that streams in central New Hampshire, which you can see in this map over here, that they remained relatively unstressed by road salt, which was fantastic news. All streams that we monitored were under the EPA's chronic toxicity concentration, which is about 230 milligrams per liter. And you can see by the y-axis in our chloride graph right here is that we were well below that. The only site that even got relatively high was closer to Dover in here. So this was, of course, great news, right, for the sites that we studied. But around the same time, research on the accumulation of chloride in surface and groundwaters was mounting. And it became very convincing and convincing enough to motivate a human behavior change, which is a pretty big thing. And this included a driver certification program here in New Hampshire that educated drivers of salting trucks and also new technology that enables them to better monitor how much salt is being applied to the road, and also when it's needed, when it doesn't make sense to apply it, and all these other different things. So it's really always nice as a researcher to know that you're doing something that can aid and give a little bit more evidence and help give baseline information for future changes in that way. And this was just an example just from last February, 2 Februarys ago, good God, looking at road salt use and just saying how New Hampshire DOT has adopted these new practices, which I felt was a really great thing to get a little press. So the next example I wanted to share, and again, I want to apologize for sort of going so superficial in all of these, but you'll see at the end how they all kind of pull together. But the next example I wanted to share focuses on scenarios in which fragmentation leads to absolute barriers to species movement, and then how those barriers and how those changes manifest in decreased genetic diversity, health of biota, as well as ultimately the resilience of our native populations. So here we're going to be focusing on brook trout and roadstream crossings. So one thing I noticed when moving to New Hampshire was it was amazing how many times you can be driving on a road, whether it's the interstate or more of a local road, how many times you cross over a stream or river. On I-93 alone, there's so many opportunities to sort of check out the Merrimack River or the Pemigewasset River because you're constantly going over it. Every time we cross over a stream or a river, we're creating a nexus or an intersection point, a potential problem point. So this map that you see right here on the left-hand side are our roads throughout New Hampshire. In the middle is a map of our waterways, and the darker blue colors are representing more water, so wider waterways, our river systems. And then over here on the right is every point here is representing that intersection of a stream and a road. And anytime a stream and a road collide, there needs to be infrastructure in place. So there are about 22,000 stream road crossings in the state of New Hampshire. All of those are opportunities for problems. Underperforming road crossings can be a serious issue. So underperforming could mean it's undersized, it's completely failing or crumbling, or maybe it's perched. And in the next slide, you'll see a picture of a perched culvert. All of those cause a risk to infrastructure. They increase the likelihood of flooding, which can cause property damages, human safety concerns, and of course, impacts to aquatic biodiversity. So the State Department of Environmental Services and the State Department of Fish and Game have worked incredibly hard over the past several years to survey stream road crossings. They've found that more than nearly 75% of stream crossings that they've surveyed so far have reduced or absolutely no passage for aquatic organisms, meaning if you happen to be on one side of this stream crossing, you cannot possibly get to the other side of that stream crossing. This can have serious impacts on populations. So when we think about river and stream fragmentation, there's a lot of different things that can occur. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical barrier. You can also have a chemical barrier or a thermal barrier, for example. But in the cases where we have these physical barriers, we see them really impacting brook trout, which is a cold adapted species native to New Hampshire. It is the only native trout species east of the Mississippi River. And culverts have also been shown to suppress macroinvertebrates, which are aquatic insects. And by suppressing them, we're reducing the amount of prey that's available for young, small brook trout. And so if you decrease the food available to them, you're going to see smaller brook trout and smaller populations as we go through. So back in 2016, a former grad student of mine jump-started a collaborative project with New Hampshire Fish and Game, PEMI, Trout Unlimited, and the Conservation Fund to assess the effects of brook trout fragmentation in the Beebe River watershed, which is located in mostly in Campton, some in Sandwich. And in 2017, these habitats were reconnected by removing culverts that were problematic. And so what you see here is a picture of a beautiful brook trout, a lovely little brook trout, but also the watershed that we worked in. And what I want to draw your attention to are these triangles here. So each one of these blue lines represents a headwater stream that is feeding into the main stem of the Beebe River that runs from east to west here. And these triangles represent stream crossings. The ones that are red are those that were considered to have absolutely no crossing, no aquatic organism crossing. So brook trout could not get from the headwaters to the main stem or from the main stem to the headwaters, and aquatic macroinvertebrates couldn't either. So we've been studying brook trout in the Beebe River watershed for more than 5 years now. Again, we started in 2016. In the summers, especially during the first 5 years, we did monthly electrofishing that started in late May to late August. And through that, we were able to monitor and recapture fish to be able to identify where they were, where they moved, how much they grew. And that's referred to as pit tag, mark and recapture efforts. During that same time, we were able to take samples, so small thin clips, which is similar to like taking a fingernail clipping of our fish to be able to analyze them for genetic diversity. And we did that in 2016, 2018, 2019. The 2016 represents before the culverts were removed, so when that network of streams was fragmented. And 2018, 2019 was 1 year and 2 years after the removal of those culverts and the installation of beautiful bridges. So the first thing that we found, it relates to the genetic structure. And I know this can be a fairly overwhelming graph, but I'm going to walk you through it. First off, we found clear evidence of reduced genetic diversity upstream of the culverts that were deemed impassable, which you can see in this image right here, which represents the genetic diversity. So in this figure, each vertical bar represents the genetic diversity within a single individual, a single brook trout. And it's the collection of all of the individuals within a given headwater stream, as noted by these labels down here. We can see both individual level diversity as well as sort of subpopulation diversity or subgroup of diversity. These, like, I always forget what these things are called. I always think of them as the no smoking signs, but these signs right here are noting the headwater streams that were impassable. So what we saw, especially with this stream that we refer to as GR3, US means upstream, is that the genetic diversity was very limited in the individuals captured upstream of the culvert in 2016. We know that because there's very little diversity within a given individual, and that was consistent all the way across all of the individuals there. And similar patterns were seen. Sorry, we have somebody in the waiting room. There we go. Similar patterns were seen in the other tributaries, those headwater streams, The individuals were very similar to each other, but nothing was as dramatic as this one. And that was really because, or what you think it's really because, is because this one had a double perched culvert. So there was no way fish were getting up into that. But what we really saw was after, in 2018, there was not that many changes had occurred. And what we suspect that this is largely because there was a lot of variability in environmental conditions, natural variability. So we had a really strong drought year one year. I think that we might even had a partial drought in the next year. So a lot of that during the summertime can affect how fish are moving. So what was interesting to us was, yes, the evidence of seeing this fragmentation was absolutely clear. And we do suspect and strongly believe that when we sample again in a few more years, we're going to see that the tributaries all look very similar and have more of a mix going on in there. We also found significant increases in macroinvertebrate density after those culverts were removed. So after the fragmentation was removed and those habitats were reconnected. And we also noted that the size of a year one brook trout, and we used year one brook trout because they tend to feed more on macroinvertebrates than larger brook trout, which will feed on smaller fish sometimes as well. That there's a direct link between their macroinvertebrate prey and those brook trout. So when we look at this graph here, I've shaded in, so this is one of the streams that was impacted by culvert removal. And you see that after the culverts were removed, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the length of fish, which is good news for the population. Also up here, what we see is an increase in macroinvertebrate density from, again, the line here represents when the culverts were removed. And so initially, in the first year afterwards, there was a modest increase, and then it really exploded. And so we do feel like this is promising information about the restoration and the impacts of reconnecting those habitats. So in a related project, sort of a spin-off project, I worked with another grad student at New Hampshire Fish and Game in the Basil Woods chapter of Trout Unlimited to develop a prioritization framework for culvert restoration. So the idea here was, in the Beebe River watershed, we got to see firsthand how fragmentation could affect a brook trout population. Now what we tried to do is take that information and identify parameters or indicators that would help us prioritize how culverts across watersheds all in New Hampshire could really be prioritized, because much of that work falls to the municipalities to decide on how to allocate funding or to apply for funding to make these changes. And so in order to do that, you kind of really need to understand what the impacts are. This grad student had worked to develop this framework, a very adaptive framework for evaluating which culverts should be replaced first, given certain money. And they developed a couple different ways. They explored several methods when they were working on it. Method A, which is depicted over here in the conceptual model, and then the results of applying that sort of spatially was depicted in this map. So that method tried to place a greater value on restoring culverts in otherwise strong brook trout habitats. Whereas method B, described down here, was thinking about placing greater value on restoring culverts in areas that were highly impacted streams. So we worked to try to develop different ways of thinking about this so that municipalities could then make a decision, make their own decision about what they valued. And this framework was developed ultimately into an Excel-based tool that municipalities could use to rank stream crossings and then have evidence from it, from the standardized process, to use to apply for the state's Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund that would help fund these changes and restoration. So last but not least, I want to just share with you a most recent example of my research. This is sort of the last tier of the effects that I mentioned from that first conceptual model. And this is related to the direct wildlife mortality that occurs as a result of, once again, the great fragmenter roads, and the decreased human well-being that occurs as a result of wildlife vehicular collisions. This recent example from nearby is not novel. Although they're likely becoming a little less frequent due to the general decline in moose populations in central New Hampshire. I highlight one part of this because I found it absolutely hilarious when I read it in the newspaper article, was that the cause of the crash was under investigation, yet it was clearly a moose, and it was clearly the drivers had collided with it. So when I read that, I laughed. I was like, what would be under investigation? It's a moose. It's definitely gonna cause people to roll off the road and unfortunately cause injuries at the same time. So wildlife vehicular collisions is not just local to areas like New Hampshire, where we think of ourselves as having tons of abundant wildlife, right? Like because of the whites and because we tend to have fairly contiguous landscapes of nature, right? That we have pretty strong populations of moose and bear, but it's a worldwide problem, absolutely worldwide problem, especially if you live in deer country, right? It's extremely problematic. And so this article is just highlighting the fact that it was even on the United Nations docket to adopt a resolution to have the number of road traffic deaths and injuries. Again, focusing on humans, but recognizing that these collisions are also threatening biodiversity worldwide. If we think about fragmentation and human well-being through this lens of wildlife vehicular collisions, the annual cost of wildlife collisions in the US is estimated to be more than $8.3 billion a year. And this is coming out of a recent study that was conducted, published in 2018 in service to the Federal Highways Agency. And that number represents vehicle damage, medical costs, law enforcement, towing costs, the cost of carcass removal, as well as the value of an animal, which I promise you they've undervalued the value of the animal included. The average cost of vehicle repair for a deer collision is, half that of a moose. And we can see how things add up. So the single animal vehicle collision average was like around $6,000 and only less than $2,500 if no human injuries were involved, right? But it's a big deal. It's a big problem. And it's one that departments of transportation and departments of safety have to really consider. On the flip side of it, the non-human side of that, pretty much any animal involved in a wildlife vehicular collision die upon impact or within a very short period of time. So they're definitely the losers in this case. All species near roads are vulnerable to the direct and indirect impacts of roads. And the most vulnerable ones are going to be things like moose, right? Vulnerable because they need to move. They need large home ranges, so they're exposed more often. So I'm currently collaborating with Eric Laflamme and Hyun Kim here at Plymouth State University on a project funded by the New Hampshire Department of Transportation to analyze vehicular collisions with wildlife and make recommendations for how they can reduce these collisions throughout the state. So this project includes mapping the occurrence of wildlife vehicular collisions that have within the state since 2002. There's been more than 27,000 animal-related collisions that have been reported. And that these have occurred on 9,000 unique road segments and with multiple incidents on more than 3,000 of our roadways. The second map sort of depicts the density of those collisions. So you can see clear relative hotspots in here, and those are definitely corresponding to population density. One can't help but see the correlation between these areas and those where population has grown initially between 2000 and 2010. And then in some areas where it's declined 2010 to 2018. So part of our project is to look for spatial and temporal patterns in these wildlife collisions to try to understand and predict them, think about where they're more likely to occur, to be able to identify areas where they could be reduced. The other thing this project is doing is sort of compiling a list of reduction strategies that have been used worldwide. So there's a range of strategies that could be entered that have been used. Most of them depend on the species of focus, but the most commonly used approaches are those that alter driver behavior. So increasing awareness, asking drivers to slow down, whether that's all the time in a specific segment of the roadway or intermittently based on seasonal transitions and timing. But generally, the other way to do it is to physically exclude wildlife from roadways, and that we see with fencing. And while fencing is between 80 to 90% effective at reducing wildlife vehicular collisions, it causes further fragmentation by creating a physical barrier to movement. So very similar to a perched culvert, except terrestrial wildlife will eventually find a way to cross over it if they really want to, whereas brook trout are kind of left high and dry. So the most effective strategy is also the most expensive, but it involves providing corridors. Corridors provide safe passage to wildlife. They protect vulnerable species from direct mortality. They connect critical habitats, which defragments our landscape, reduces wildlife collisions, and therefore improves human safety. And these three pictures here are depicting different options for connectivity or corridors. Sort of our classic culvert that allows terrestrial movement as well as aquatic movement. You can be seen in the top two. And then another one in here where this is sort of a raised bridge that connects two highland areas and provides ample area for terrestrial wildlife to pass through. So I'm happy to report that New Hampshire Fish and Game has recognized this threat of fragmentation and released a report in 2018 exploring wildlife corridors, and have since worked extremely hard to develop these spatially explicit layers of data that can be used in a GIS to support planning and restoration decisions. With such data that was first completed for the coastal region of New Hampshire, the Nature Conservancy has taken lead on increasing safe passage for wildlife through different corridors. And in this image here, you can see what it looked like before and what it looked like after, and how the after really enhances aquatic passage in the streamway, but also there's what we refer to as sort of like a critter transport area in here that allows terrestrial wildlife to pass through. So in our New Hampshire DOT funded project, we're examining the density of wildlife vehicular collisions on roadways, as seen on the left here, this left map here. So the highlighting, the purple is going to be roadways that have had, I think it was between 7 and 15 collisions over the past 15 years. And then the pink ones are going to be those that had way more than that, in a higher number of upwards of 72 collisions over the past, or between 2002 and 2019. And so these are areas that represent a persistent problem for human safety and wildlife hazards. So we're looking into identifying those areas. We're also examining these alongside the New Hampshire Fish and Game produced maps of priority habitat blocks, which are depicted in these maps in green, and wildlife corridors that they've been able to depict for the entire state to predict in here. So together we can use these as well as conservation lands and existing stream crossings to identify areas where connectivity can be prioritized. And this will provide evidence and decision support to New Hampshire DOT as well as local municipalities on how to invest infrastructure changes and hopefully increase the integration of this knowledge into new development, not just retrofitting. So in closing, I sort of want to thank you for sticking with me along the way. There's a lot of different things that my research has done, and it really has come under the umbrella. Ultimately, to fight the fates of fragmentation, we need to first acknowledge that it's already occurring. For me, when I first moved here, I don't know, I think I was living in a cloud or something. I didn't realize how much it was still around me and how it's creeping. And so if anything, I feel more empowered now to make a change. This is an opportunity to step in and recognize that what we have here in New Hampshire, especially in the White Mountains region, is so precious and it is so rare these days that we need to represent it and we need to protect it, not just for New Hampshireites, but for everyone really. We are, a very connected globe these days. So it's already happening. It's happening at multiple scales, multiple magnitudes, and at a variety of levels of reversibility. New Hampshire is not immune to fragmentation. We need to take action now. We can identify intact habitat blocks for conservation. We can identify wildlife corridors between these blocks to maintain that connectivity and provide safe passage to wildlife to get through those so that they can continue to provide and enhance the natural processes that create that pattern, that texture, that feel, that sense that we have when we're in nature. We can do this in a very cost-effective way by combining our efforts. When we're retrofitting, we can look at road crossings that will serve both terrestrial connectivity and aquatic connectivity like culverts. We can minimize new development induced fragmentation through design and innovation. We know everything we need to know. We just need to put it into action. So with that, I want to thank you again for all your attention. Please feel free to unmute. I would love to see you. So I'm going to stop my sharing so that I can see you all, if that's okay. So let me.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was fabulous. We already have two comments and questions in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read the first one out. Becky Moore says, Amy, this is a superb, clear, and concise explanation of a very complex subject. Question, your research suggests that conservation easements, which do not aim for maximum interior habitat, even narrow contiguous easements, could result in increase in edge and decline in biodiversity. Does this suggest policies which identify large-scale wildlife corridors?
So I'm not
talking
sure.
about, where the private landowners,
Yes.
You get these sort of funny shapes because
Yes.
that's the size of my plot and that's the
Yes.
size of Becky's plot.
Yes.
And so how do we,
This is the perfect question, because this is actually the last thing that I didn't put in there. And that's the idea that what plagues me about New Hampshire is that we tend to work at the municipality level. Every municipality is making decisions for themselves. But what we're missing is the big picture. When Plymouth makes a decision, we need to be thinking about what Rumney's doing, what Campton's doing, what Ashland's doing together, because what we need is bigger thinking. We need contiguous habitats. So fragmentation is occurring at all different scales. If a private landowner has the opportunity to conserve even a portion of their habitat, or even if you think about it from a gardening perspective, planting native vegetation that provides corridors that are not, it's not like having a contiguous forest, but it's protecting and enhancing the habitat for certain species like our pollinators. So conservation easements, especially those that can be in, and even common use lands in areas that are part of these prioritized corridors, are amazing regardless of the shape, because they're connecting. And so the idea of the corridor is not that wildlife is necessarily going to hang out there. It's that they can get from those big patches, those contiguous patches that have that rich interior landscape, that protected area, that they can get from one to the other safely. And so most people don't necessarily want a huge, bear population right in their backyard. But if you are protecting the landscape and connecting it, so we have a mosaic that goes beyond the borders of municipalities, then it's a great service. And I don't know if that was the question, but I totally took it as a springboard to add that one piece.
Thanks so much. So Marcia then said, fascinating, Amy. Are there simple things that we as individuals can do to help decrease habitat? Contacting our legislators to support habitat coordinators, yes, but other things. And you maybe touched on this a little bit with the planting natives for corridors, but can you, this is something I was very interested in as well, as someone who's just moving back and thinking about what can I do to help?
Yeah, so there's so many different scales that you can think of. If you're on, I was having this conversation yesterday, actually with my hairdresser, which was an awesome conversation. She's an intensive gardener, like amazing gardener, and she plants all natives. And we were just talking about how she used her own land, right, to connect. She has fluid connectivity. She's planted species that promote pollinators moving in, native bird species coming in, recognizing what's around you and not fighting it necessarily, recognizing the nature in which you are folded in and going with it. The other thing, so that's on your own property. The other thing is, and this is something that I highly recommend to everybody, is have a voice, communicate with your conservation commission. That is, and our regional planning commissions. Like, there's so many opportunities for local people to have a voice and so many avenues. It's just a matter of getting together. So I can tell you that in the state of New Hampshire, and this is motivated by New Hampshire Fish and Game, taking action for wildlife. There's this fabulous program, and I'm so fortunate to be involved in it this year, called the Community Conservation Cohort program. And this is absolutely what they're promoting, is this idea is promoting connectivity, connoting habitat protections, good stewardship of the lands that we have, identifying lands that are needed and prioritizing those in that way. Absolutely writing to legislator to really show the value of nature, right? Like, it's not that logging is an issue. It's not that building a new house is an issue. It's not that a new road is an issue. It's that all of those things done not mindfully is going to cause a problem, and that economics might serve us well in the short term, but in the long term, it's eroding away at our capacity. And that capacity is not just for New Hampshire, right? Like, that's everywhere. It really is novel in the US where we live right now, especially in the East. It's so precious.
Thanks. And Althea added and this goes, I think, along with what you were just saying too, about the Upper Valley Land Trust is a good resource for the Upper Connecticut River Valley.
Absolutely. Yes. And we have the Pemmy Baker Land Trust as well. So land trusts, conservation commissions, and that's if you're fortunate enough to have land that you can contribute. But, you know, there's plenty of other ways too. The idea is to just pay attention, right? Like, to see where things are occurring, think about them. If there's an opportunity for public comment, share it. I hate to say it, but it's like, oftentimes it's just, you need a little bit of friction to give people pause, to give them the opportunity to think critically about what's going on, to take that moment and reflect and really see it. And also there's tons out there, and I can't say more about academic partnerships, right? Like, having academics involved, having the researchers that are passionate about these things lend a voice to communities, I think is so empowering. And at Plymouth State University, we're like dedicated to doing that. There's always somebody there that wants to partner with somebody off campus to make, because it's sort of our calling, it's our service, it's why we're here in many ways, not just the students. It's, you know, we love it here. I chose to be here. Could have been, you know, a lot of different places, but this is it. This is home. So.
And now you know why we have the Mountain Voices series. Amy, this was so fabulous. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed it, and it appears that the people I can see similarly. Yes, lots of clapping going on for you. I also really appreciate the passion that you brought. And also, just this is what we do. You know, this is what Plymouth State does. And this is a resource for not just the White Mountains, but for the entire state and the region. And you're a perfect example for that. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. And I'll just throw it out there. I'd like throw my business card at you if I had, just because they're like in my desk and they're collecting dust. But honestly, I'd say, you know, the Center for the Environment, Plymouth State University, we are here for anything. So like, if something comes up, you hear about it, you need more information, or you need an ally, we're here. So don't forget about us.
So one thing, Amy, is I think that this talk, I know it's been recorded, but I think your talk would be wonderful for conservation commissions to be able to show at their local meetings.
Thank you.
I really do, and I'm going to suggest it to the one in Lancaster immediately.
Excellent.
I'll take it on the road, on the Zoom road.
Well, thanks everyone. Eric DeLeo, by the way, Amy said that he will be in contact with you.
I saw that. That's good. I gave the thumbs up. That works great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Stay warm.
I've got two more things. Hang in there, guys. You may see that my enter hits you soon. I want to remind you that the museum appreciates members and membership, and I put the donation button there. And please donate. You make it possible for the museum to do what it does. So while Plymouth State supports a lot of it, the exhibits need you. The other thing I want to remind you is that Mountain Voices is recorded, and you can see not only this one, but other earlier recordings at the link I just put in there. Or if you type in Museum of the White Mountains, Mountain Voices, you will also be able to find it. Thank you, everyone. We will see you again on February 10th, when Professor Brian Eisenhower will talk about the impact of second homes on northern forest. We look forward to seeing you then again, February 10th. Thanks, everyone.